The Rough Ashlar, Episode 3, Wounded at Savannah. Colonel, Capture, and the Cost of Signing. What's up, you magnificent bastards? Welcome back to the Masonic Files, where we cut the powdered wig fluff and talk straight about brothers who actually live the craft while grinding from nothing. This is Episode 3 of our 4-part deep dive into Brother George Walton. In Episode 1, we watched the Virginia carpenter's apprentice hustle south and rise. In Episode 2, we saw the flip from ambitious young attorney to president of the Georgia Provincial Congress and youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence on August 2, 1776. Now, the words on parchment meet British steel. After signing the Declaration in Philadelphia, Walton didn't linger for parades or political backslapping that hadn't been earned yet. He rode south hell-bent for leather, pushing his horse and himself through long days and short nights, knowing the war was about to get ugly in Georgia. The colony was still a fractured mess, loyalists thick as fleas on a hound, British ships prowling the coast, and Patriot forces scraping together whatever militia they could muster from farmers, shopkeepers, and drifters who were civilians one day and soldiers the next. He received a colonel's commission and took command of the 1st Georgia Regiment. Turning that ragtag bunch into anything resembling a fighting force was going to be its own special kind of hell. These weren't polished Continentals with crisp uniforms and regular pay. Half showed up with rusty muskets, granddaddy's fowling piece, or nothing but a hunting knife and a bad attitude. Ammunition was so scarce. They joked about throwing rocks and harsh language if the powder ran out. They nearly had to do just that a few times. And shoes. Most men drilled barefoot in the red Georgia clay, cursing every step that left their feet raw and bleeding. Walton drilled them relentlessly. From dawn till dusk he rode up and down the lines, barking orders until his voice was raw. He inspected weapons personally, showed men how to load and fire under pressure, and made sure they at least knew which end of the musket the ball came out of. Apparently, the non-commissioned officer corps was not as well developed as it is today because some of the stuff Colonel Walton did was definitely NCO business. Some loved him for the intensity. Others bitched under their breath that the carpenter colonel was riding them like rented mules. Walton didn't lose sleep over it. He'd taken harsher criticism from his uncle growing up in Virginia. The man who taught himself law by firelight wasn't about to half-ass military command when British regulars were coming. The days were brutal. Sweat-soaked uniforms stuck to skin. Mosquitoes feasted on exposed flesh. Food was whatever could be foraged or begged from local farms. Walton moved among the men, sharing their hardships, cursing alongside them when supplies failed to arrive, and pushing them harder because he knew softness would get them all killed. He slept little, ate less, and carried the weight of knowing that if his regiment broke, Savannah and much of Georgia could fall with it. December 1778 brought the storm. British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell launched a surprise assault on Savannah. The city was lightly defended, and the Patriots got caught flat-footed. Walton's regiment slammed straight into the meat grinder. The fighting tore through the humid streets and outskirts. Musket smoke so thick you could chew it. Men screaming orders and curses. Horses bolting in panic. The sick, sweet smell of blood mixing with marsh rot and gunpowder. Cannon fire boomed from the river. Bayonets flashed in the chaos. The air was filled with the crack of muskets, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, and the constant roar of battle. Walton was right in the thick of it, leading from the front like so many self-made officers did in those early years. He rode among his men, shouting encouragement mixed with colorful threats about what he'd do to anyone who broke and ran. His voice cut through the din. "Hold the line, you sorry bastards. We didn't come this far to run like whipped dogs." He directed companies, plugged gaps where men fell, and kept the regiment from dissolving under the British pressure. Sweat poured down his face. His bad leg already ached from the long campaign. But he ignored it. Then the ball struck. A British musket round slammed into his thigh like a sledgehammer from hell. The impact was brutal. White-hot pain exploded up his leg. His horse panicked and reared violently, throwing him hard. He hit the ground amid the chaos, blood pouring from the wound, British troops swarming the area. There was no dramatic last stand, no cinematic slow-motion defiance. Just the ugly immediate reality of a man bleeding in the dirt while the battle rolled right over him. British soldiers closed in fast. Walton, bleeding heavily and unable to rise effectively, was captured on the field. Rough hands grabbed him, dragged him away from the fighting. Pain radiated with every heartbeat. The ball had torn through muscle and likely nicked bone. Field surgeons did what they could, probing the wound, bandaging it tightly, offering what little opium or whiskey was available. But the damage was done. He would limp for the rest of his life. Gunshot wounds, especially to the leg, are counterintuitive events. You might think that getting shot in the leg is a preferred location, if you happen to lack the good sense to avoid being shot in the first place. Au contraire, mon frère. The legs are chocked full of little bleedy bits that will exsanguinate the rest of the body in quick order. And as to the rush of, "We've got to get the ball out," yeah, that's kind of bullshit too. They didn't really know any better back then. But short of the bullet preventing range of motion issues or presenting as a danger to blood flow, it's just as often left in place nowadays. There are plenty of people walking around today with a bullet lodged in them because it would have done more damage to retrieve it than leaving it alone. Enough of my war stories. Back to Walton's. Savannah fell quickly that day. The British now had a solid southern base, and Colonel George Walton was their prisoner. The months that followed were a grinding test of will. Captivity for American officers varied, but it was rarely comfortable. Overcrowded quarters, bad food that was often spoiled or infested, poor sanitation that turned wounds septic, and the constant mental grind of wondering if the cause was collapsing while you sat useless behind enemy lines. Days blurred into one another, long hours of boredom punctuated by sharp pain from the thigh wound, the humiliation of being disarmed and guarded, and the nagging fear that the British might decide to make examples of men whose names were on the Declaration. The rank-and-file rebellious infantry soldier was one thing, easy enough to pardon with a promise to go home and behave in the future. But what was the fate of their officers? And what of an officer who signed the gigantic middle finger to the king? Surely a return to society with any resemblance to antebellum life was likely a long shot. Walton endured it with the same stubborn discipline that once kept him reading law books after 16-hour days swinging a hammer. He bitched when it was warranted, loudly and colorfully, but he kept his head when others broke down. He traded what little he had for better bandages or extra rations for the men around him. He listened to stories from fellow prisoners, offered what encouragement he could, and refused to let despair take root. The same man who measured lumber precisely now measured his own conduct under pressure, refusing to give the British the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. Some days the pain from the leg was so bad he could barely stand. Other days the boredom was worse, sitting in damp rooms, listening to rain on the roof, wondering if Dorothy and the children were safe, if Georgia was still holding, if the whole revolution was about to go up in smoke. Letters were rare and heavily censored. News from the outside world trickled in like water through a cracked dam, sometimes hopeful, often grim. He spent nearly 10 months in that grind before being exchanged in late 1779. When he finally returned to American lines, he was thinner, scarred, in constant pain from the thigh, and pissed off at the world. But he was not broken. The carpenter's apprentice turned colonel had paid in blood for the name he put on that paper. The Georgia legislature, desperate for experienced leaders, elected him governor in 1779, while large parts of the state were still under British occupation. It was a brutal, short-term gig. Civil government was barely hanging on by a thread. Supplies were almost non-existent. Loyalist raiders hit farms and outposts like wolves, and political infighting refused to take a vacation, even while the British were literally in the backyard. Walton limped through it all, organizing what militia remained, trying to keep courts functioning, begging for support from a continental Congress that had its own problems. Old rivalries with Button Gwinnett and Lyman Hall factions still simmered beneath the surface. Some continued whispering about the pushy Virginian who rose too fast. Dorothy managed the household and children through the long absences, the capture news, and the chaos of a half-occupied state. The wound, the months in captivity, and the desperate governorship tested every tool he carried. The square helped him measure desperate decisions when resources were gone. The chisel kept refining him through pain and frustration. The compasses bounded egos so political knives didn't fracture what little unity Georgia had left. Solomon's Lodge connections quietly helped when he needed trusted men in uncertain times. He lived the obligation in the ugly practical work of trying to hold a fractured colony together while bleeding from a British ball, and wondering if the whole revolution was about to collapse. Next episode, we follow the long post-war grind. Recovery, multiple terms as Chief Justice and Governor, U.S. Senator, Treaty Commissioner, University Trustee, and the steady building of Georgia until his death. This has been Episode 3 of the Masonic Files on Brother George Walton, the Rough Ashlar series, Wounded at Savannah, Colonel Capture and the Cost of Signing. Hit subscribe. Share this with your lodge brothers or anyone who has taken a real hit after signing up for the grind. I'll catch you in Episode 4, The Final Square. Stay square. Stay savage. Stay Masonic.